Why did his eyes stop on her? Out of nearly 300 Marines standing in formation, why hers? The morning heat in Georgia was merciless. Already the air clung to uniforms like damp sheets, sweat trickling down spines beneath rigid postures. Boots gleamed in polished rows, rifles stood like silent companions, and 289 Marines of Charlie Company braced themselves for another day at Camp Lejeune. The parade ground shimmered in the sunlight, the kind that made men squint even before dawn. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood in the third row, her chin set, her eyes fixed forward. At 28, she'd learned how to hide discomfort beneath a mask of unflinching discipline. Her boots were flawless black mirrors in the sun, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she refused to give anyone an excuse. She had been given excuses her whole career: too small, too soft, too female. She had burned every one of them to ash. Her record spoke for itself: 3 deployments to Afghanistan, a Bronze Star for valor, and Marines who would follow her into hell if she asked. She had carried bodies heavier than her own across fields where bullets ripped the air like angry wasps. She had seen blood, too much of it, and she had made choices that still lived in the quiet hours of night. That morning, though, she looked like any other Marine in the formation, until his eyes found her. Gunnery Sergeant Jake Morrison stepped forward. 6'4", broad-shouldered, every inch carved from steel and arrogance. His voice carried across the ground with the weight of command, sharp as a whip. Morrison was the kind of Marine who didn't have to shout to make men flinch, though he often did. His reputation was legend: an iron fist wrapped in desert camo, a leader who believed fear was the only currency worth trading. But Morrison also believed something else. He believed women had no place here. That belief wasn't written in orders, wasn't in any handbook, but it was in the way his gaze lingered too long on Santos, in the slight curl of his lip when he spoke of standards, in the way he mentioned weeding out those who couldn't handle the pressure, while his eyes, cold as bayonet steel, pinned her. The formation shifted, unseen but felt. Marines heard what was not said. The challenge had been issued. Dismissal came like a crack of a rifle bolt. "Company, fall out," Morrison barked, and rows broke into movement. Boots thundered, chatter rose, but the undercurrent was thick. Everyone knew who had been marked. Santos gathered her squad. She always did it the same way, calm, methodical, never with wasted words. Private First Class Thompson, barely 19 and still soft around the edges, fumbled with his gloves. Nervous energy radiated off him like static. Beside him, Lance Corporal Rodriguez caught Santos's eye. He was older, hardened by 2 deployments, and his nod was steady but edged with warning. Morrison was watching. Arms crossed, jaw tight, his shadow stretched across the obstacle course like a storm front rolling in. The course itself was brutal. Rope climbs slick with humidity, walls that scraped skin raw, mud pits that swallowed boots, and tires that broke rhythm. Santos had done it 100 times, knew every inch, every burn in the muscle. But today the course wasn't about endurance. It was about eyes, his eyes. She led them through. Every command was precise, her voice cutting through the heat. "Drive your knees, keep low, don't fight the mud, flow through it." She demonstrated when needed, scaling walls, sliding under wire, showing them not just what to do but how to believe they could. Her leadership wasn't barked orders or humiliation. It was steady pressure, iron wrapped in patience. And it worked. Times were sharp. Movements were clean. Her squad moved like a machine, sweating, panting, but proud. Then he moved in. Morrison's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his frame blotting out the sun for those near him. His words started measured, almost casual. "Soft," he said, eyeing Santos's Marines. "Too soft." He critiqued form, nitpicked timing, threw barbs meant to wound. His voice carried deliberately, ensuring every nearby Marine could hear. Santos felt the burn in her chest, not from exertion but from anger held tight, clamped down. She answered calmly, her tone professional, words clipped and factual. Squad execution was above average gunny. Completion time is documented. Her restraint was her shield. She would not give him what he wanted, An outburst, a crack, a weakness to exploit. But he pressed harder. You think your Bronze Star makes you bulletproof. You think pulling some wounded out of the dirt makes you combat ready. That's politics, Staff Sergeant, nothing more. The words hit like a blade slipped under armor. Politics. He was stripping her valor down to paper and signatures, calling her courage a lie in front of nearly 300 Marines. The memory flashed: Helmand Province, gunfire shredding the air, bodies heavier than her frame dragging them through dirt and blood. She had stayed. She had fought. She had bled. That medal was not politics. It was the weight of 3 lives carried out of hell. The Marines around her shifted uneasily. Some knew her story. Some had fought beside her. Others had only heard whispers, but every one of them knew what Morrison was doing, cutting at her core, daring her to bleed in front of them. He stepped closer. His size was a weapon. His shadow swallowed her. His breath was hot, heavy with menace. He questioned her fitness, her toughness, her right to wear the uniform, each word designed not to test but to break. And still she stood, straight, unflinching, answering with calm precision. She listed her record, her squad's performance, her deployments. Each fact laid down like a brick, building a wall against his assault. Her voice never rose, her hands never shook. But his patience thinned. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck flexed. Then he did it, his critical mistake. He reached out and laid his hand on her shoulder. It was nothing and everything at once. A touch that in another place could mean camaraderie, guidance, correction. But here, under the eyes of 289 Marines, it was different. It was a claim of power, a deliberate violation, a hand pressing down not to steady but to dominate. The silence was deafening. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. Every Marine froze, caught between disbelief and expectation. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed. Santos felt the weight of it, the heat of his palm burning through her uniform. She had choices. She always had choices. She could step aside, swallow it, let the moment pass. She could protect her career by bending her spine just slightly, the way so many had before. Or she could choose the harder road, the one that would burn bridges and ignite fire. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes locked on his, and her voice cut through the silence. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, remove your hand immediately. That contact is inappropriate and unprofessional. Her words rang out across the parade ground, each syllable crisp, undeniable. The kind of words that turn a moment into an incident, a confrontation into a report. A ripple moved through the formation, shock, awe, a tremor of history being written in real time. Morrison's face darkened. Rage twisted his features. His authority had been challenged, publicly, formally, in front of hundreds, and by her. You will not speak to me that way, Staff Sergeant, he growled, menace dripping from every word. I'll have your stripes for insubordination. He stepped closer, looming, trying to reclaim ground he had already lost. But Santos didn't move. Inside, her heart pounded like a drum. Her blood was fire, but her voice stayed steady. She had prepared her whole career for this. Combat wasn't always bullets. Sometimes it was the war inside the uniform. You have made inappropriate contact and are now threatening my career in front of witnesses, she said clearly. I am formally requesting that this incident be documented and reported through proper channels. Your behavior is unbecoming of a Marine. Gasps broke the silence. Marines who had never dared breathe in defiance felt their lungs catch. She had flipped the battlefield. Regulations were her weapon. Witnesses were her armor. Morrison's jaw clenched, and then his second mistake. He grabbed her arm. Fingers tightened around her sleeve, rough, pulling. And in that instant, he crossed from intimidation into assault. Her body reacted before thought could catch it. Years of training surged through muscle memory. A twist, a step, a shift. His grip broke, her frame turning fluidly, repositioning herself in defense. The move was clean, professional, by the book, and her words cut through the air. That's assault, Gunnery Sergeant. You've just committed assault against a subordinate in front of witnesses." Her tone wasn't just firm, it was final. The gavel had dropped. The battle lines were no longer between him and her, but between him and the institution itself. The silence cracked into murmurs, Marines whispering, eyes wide, knowing they had just seen a moment that would ripple far beyond this field. Morrison froze, his own rage collapsing under the weight of realization. His career, his power, his name, it all teetered on the edge. And Santos, she stood there, spine straight, eyes unwavering, not triumphant, not even angry, just resolute. Because sometimes dignity doesn't roar, it doesn't rage, it doesn't need fists or fury. Sometimes dignity simply stands. And in standing, it breaks men who thought they could not be broken. What happens when silence finally breaks? When the voices that never spoke suddenly find their courage? The parade ground was still. Dust hung in the air, suspended between disbelief and inevitability. Hundreds of Marines shifted, not daring to breathe too loudly, not daring to move. They had just witnessed the impossible, a staff sergeant standing her ground against a gunnery sergeant, rules and regulations turned into weapons sharper than any bayonet. And then footsteps cut through the hush. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, tall and weathered from 2 decades of service in Iraq and Afghanistan, stepped out from the administration building. His uniform was pressed, his stride steady, his presence magnetic. Williams wasn't a man who relied on intimidation. He didn't need to. Leadership radiated from him in a different way, measured, watchful, built on competence instead of fear. "What's the situation here?" His voice was calm, but it carried. Every Marine straightened. Morrison dropped his grip as if the contact burned him, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Santos pivoted sharply, her bearing immaculate despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. "Sir," she began, her voice clipped, precise, professional. She laid out the facts like evidence presented to a jury. Inappropriate comments about her record, intimidation, unwanted contact, assault in front of witnesses. Each word was exact, each detail clean, delivered not with emotion but with the authority of truth. Morrison tried to counter. His voice was sharper, edged with panic beneath the veneer of confidence. "Misinterpretation, sir. A simple disagreement between leaders. She overreacted, took my actions out of context." He framed himself as the victim, wrapped his excuses in tradition. It was the old tactic: call professionalism weakness, call harassment leadership, call abuse discipline. But no one moved to back him, not this time. The Marines stood like statues, their eyes forward but their silence heavy. They had been forced to choose. They could cling to fear, to the old ways, or they could stand behind the truth. The first to break ranks was the youngest, Private First Class Thompson, his hands trembling, his voice unsteady but his courage unshakable. He stepped forward, his words loud enough for all to hear. "Sir, I witnessed the entire incident. Staff Sergeant Santos conducted herself professionally throughout. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison made inappropriate contact and threatened her career." For a moment no one moved. Then another stepped out. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, his voice steady, seasoned. "Sir, I confirm the private statement. Morrison's actions were deliberate. We all saw it." The dam cracked. Marines who had once been silent out of fear began to speak. One by one, they added their voices to the record, each testimony layering truth upon truth, until Morrison's version of events collapsed under the weight of collective witness. It was no longer Santos against Morrison. It was Santos and 289 Marines against a single man's abuse of power. Williams nodded once slowly, his eyes sharp with the gravity of what was unfolding. "Both of you my office, now." The company was dismissed. Boots shuffled, voices murmured, but the weight lingered. They all knew they had witnessed something historic, something that would ripple through every barracks, every mess hall, every corridor of the base before nightfall. Inside the office, the air was cooler, but the tension was hotter than the Georgia sun outside. Santos stood rigid, every muscle taut, her composure a fragile mask. Morrison loomed, still trying to reclaim authority with sheer presence. Williams didn't give him the chance. "Staff Sergeant, give me a full account. Start from the beginning." Santos did. She spoke with surgical precision, dates, times, words, tone, placement. Her testimony was clinical, yet beneath the formality, the weight of lived memory pressed through. When she finished, there was no doubt her words were both credible and devastating. "Gunnery Sergeant," Williams turned. Morrison exhaled as though this were all beneath him. He spun a different story. "Sir, this is an overreaction. I was correcting her leadership style. Her approach is soft. Marines need hard leadership. She resisted correction. She was disrespectful. That's insubordination. My contact was routine supervisory intervention, blown out of proportion by her agenda." His words fell heavy, but hollow. A defense built not on fact, but on old prejudices dressed as justification. Williams leaned back. He had heard enough. This is no longer a matter for the chain of command. This is an official incident. Military police will be involved. Statements will be taken. Both of your careers hang in the balance of this investigation. For Morrison, it was the first time the reality pierced through. His face tightened, eyes narrowing, rage turning inward. For Santos, it was confirmation of the road she had chosen. Harder, riskier, but necessary. That afternoon, military police entered the narrative. Not with sirens or shouting, but with pens, cameras, forms. They photographed, they logged, they documented. Witness lists were drawn. Statements were filed. The process had begun, and once begun, it could not be contained. Word spread like fire in dry grass. By evening chow, every barracks buzzed. She stood up to him, said it in front of everyone. MPs were called. "It's going to court-martial." Whispers carried, stories twisted, but the truth remained. The old order had cracked, and something new was forcing its way in. Santos ate quietly that night. Alone at a corner table, the hum of conversation around her like static. Some glanced with admiration, others with suspicion. She knew what they were saying, that she was brave, that she was reckless, that she had destroyed a career, that she had saved lives. All of it, none of it. She chewed slowly, the taste of her food drowned out by the weight in her chest. Because courage wasn't clean. It came with cost, and she could already feel it pressing in. In the days that followed, interviews stretched for hours. Investigators asked the same questions from different angles, probing, testing, measuring her answers against others. Each retelling was a knife twisting old wounds deeper, but she held steady. Truth doesn't bend. Marines came forward with more than expected. Stories surfaced. Not just that day on the parade ground, but years of smaller moments, overlooked complaints, shrugged off warnings, inappropriate comments, subtle threats, the unspoken currency of fear. What Morrison had done wasn't new. It was simply the first time someone had stopped playing by the rules of silence. For some Marines, it was a release. Finally, someone had cut through the fear, and now they could too. For others, it was betrayal. The institution was supposed to stay sealed, problems handled inside, not exposed. Their resentment was quieter, but Santos felt it like shadows moving behind her. At night, when the base went still, she lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The questions came then, sharp and cruel. Had she gone too far? Had she doomed herself to isolation? Would she ever again be judged for her work, or would this moment stain every evaluation, every promotion board, every whisper in the halls? She turned over, closed her eyes, tried to push the thoughts away. But in the quiet, another memory surfaced. Helmand Province. The weight of bodies slung over her shoulders, the crack of rifles in the distance, the taste of blood and sand. She hadn't quit then. She wouldn't quit now. And yet courage didn't make her invincible. It made her human. She still woke with her heart pounding, still carried the ache of being doubted, still longed, secretly, desperately, for someone to simply say, "You're not alone." The investigation deepened. Officers reviewed efficiency reports, performance evaluations, counseling records. Morrison's file was opened wider than he'd ever expected. Patterns emerged, warnings ignored, reports buried, informal corrective talks that left scars instead of lessons. For the first time, the fortress of his authority showed cracks visible to everyone. And the Marines were watching. Every step, every rumor, every development. They had witnessed the spark. Now they wanted to see if the fire would burn. In the Chow Hall, Private Thompson whispered to Rodriguez, "You think she'll make it through this?" Rodriguez didn't answer right away. He watched Santos enter, her tray steady, her gaze forward, walking through the stairs without flinching. Finally, he said quietly, "If anyone can, it's her. But it's not just her fight anymore. It's ours too." The words lingered, because everyone knew he was right. What happens when a single voice forces others to speak? When silence becomes impossible, even for those who swore they'd never risk it. The investigation spread like oil in water, slow at first, then unstoppable. It started with the parade ground testimonies, the young Marine who dared step forward, the seasoned ones who confirmed his words. But then the circle widened. One interview led to another. One name uncovered a second. A pattern emerged, no longer whispers, no longer rumors. Military police filled notepads with details that, piece by piece, painted a damning portrait. Corporal Jackson spoke with the steady cadence of a Marine who had seen too much and knew the cost of silence. He described how Morrison positioned himself during training sessions, not to mentor but to dominate. How comments cut deeper than corrections, designed not to build but to break. His voice was level, but the weight behind his words was unshakable. Then came Lance Corporal Martinez. Her testimony was quieter, reluctant, heavy with the burden of remembering. She spoke of late nights, casual remarks that were never casual, suggestions disguised as jokes. Of careers threatened subtly, opportunities dangled and withdrawn, always under the shadow of retaliation. She had kept it inside for years, but watching Santos stand had given her permission to finally release it. Piece by piece, Morrison's fortress crumbled. The image of a respected, iron-willed leader gave way to something uglier. A man who had built his authority not on strength but on fear, not on respect but on intimidation. And Santos, she lived in a strange duality. By day she was professional calm, carrying out her duties as if nothing had changed. She trained her squad, reviewed reports, corrected form on the range. Outwardly she was composed, but at night the weight pressed in. Every interview was a reminder that she had set something in motion that could not be undone. She walked past Marines in the corridors who looked at her with admiration or suspicion or something in between. Some whispered encouragement. Others stayed silent, their eyes unreadable. She didn't need words to feel the division carving through the unit like a blade. In the quiet of her quarters, she sometimes caught herself doubting. Had I done the right thing? The thought was poisonous, crawling through her chest. She reminded herself of the hand on her shoulder, the grip on her arm, the eyes of 289 Marines watching. She reminded herself that silence had never stopped men like Morrison. It had only fed them. Still, she was human, and the weight of being the center of a storm left her tired in ways combat never had. The investigation reached deeper, records pulled, evaluations scrutinized. Morrison's file, once a shield, became evidence. Notes of corrective conversations, instances of complaints that never moved forward, counseling signed but never escalated, small red flags ignored until they bled into this moment. Then came the others. Female Marines who had once stayed silent now found their voices. One described comments about her fitness for combat that were laced with derision, the kind of remarks that ate away at confidence in silence. Another spoke of unwanted attention, the kind that seemed harmless on the surface but left her always looking over her shoulder. They had never filed complaints. Fear had bound them. But Santos had broken that fear. The base began to feel different. Conversations in chow halls carried tension. Some praised her as the kind of leader the Corps needed, courageous, unshakable, willing to confront rot even when it wore rank. Others saw her as dangerous, a disruptor, a Marine who had turned inward what was supposed to stay hidden. That division cut deeper than any investigation, because culture was harder to fight than one man. By the second week, the investigation had expanded beyond Camp Lejeune. Former subordinates were contacted, old duty stations revisited. What emerged wasn't just misconduct. It was a pattern stretching years. Morrison's iron fist had left dents everywhere he'd been. Some small, some deep, but all undeniable when connected. Santos carried herself as though untouched by it all, but inside she felt the edges fray. She had been in firefights where death was only inches away, but this was slower, grinding. It wasn't bullets. It was whispers, stares. The knowledge that every Marine who saw her now measured her not by her bronze star, not by her leadership, but by this fight. Late one night she sat on her bunk, uniform folded with perfect precision beside her, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the bass was faint through the walls. Her hands were clasped together, not in prayer but in tension. She thought of Helmand again, the smoke, the heat, the choice to stay and fight. She thought of the 3 lives she had carried from the dirt. She whispered, barely audible, "This isn't about me. It never was." And in that whisper, she found resolve again. When the media caught scent of the story, the pressure multiplied. It leaked first through veterans groups, then advocacy organizations, until suddenly it was more than a case. It was a symbol. The Marine Corps was being watched, not just by its own, but by the country, and that spotlight burned. Some Marines resented it. "She brought the outside in," they muttered. Others saw it differently. "She forced them to see what we've lived with." At the center of it all, Santos kept moving forward, step by step, bearing steady, composure unbroken. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she simply endured. Morrison, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave. The sight of him no longer stalking the training grounds was jarring. For years, his presence had been like a storm cloud always looming. Now he was gone and the air felt strange, lighter for some, unsettling for others. But absence didn't erase his shadow. He still lingered in conversations, in fears of retaliation, in the quiet doubts of those who wondered if he might somehow claw his way back. The investigation turned toward court-martial. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too many, the silence too broken. Administrative action wasn't enough. The Corps couldn't bury this, not with hundreds watching, not with eyes outside the gates paying attention. Santos knew what that meant. She wouldn't just be a staff sergeant leading a squad anymore. She would be a witness, the center of a trial that would be dissected, debated, judged. She would sit in a courtroom with eyes on her again, not the eyes of her Marines this time, but of lawyers, officers, strangers. It was a battlefield of a different kind, but no less dangerous, because bullets take life, words take futures. She didn't flinch. But when she lay down at night, she felt the weight in her chest. Not fear for herself, but for what it meant, for every Marine who watched, for every young recruit learning what leadership was supposed to be. The Corps was at a crossroads, and she was standing at the very center. And sometimes, the center of history feels less like triumph, and more like standing alone in the dark. What does courage look like when it's under oath? When the truth you've carried must be spoken aloud, dissected, doubted, and tested until it either shatters or holds. 3 months after the parade ground, the courtroom felt heavier than any battlefield. Not because of danger in the air, but because of expectation. The room was paneled with dark wood, Marine insignias glinting above the judge's bench. The air was stiff, the silence broken only by shuffling boots and the faint creak of benches as Marines filed in to witness history. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos entered wearing her dress blues. Every ribbon polished, every medal aligned, her uniform was not just fabric, it was testimony. Years of service, deployments, sacrifice. But today those decorations were more than pride. They were her shield. She carried not just her record, but the weight of 289 Marines who had seen what happened that morning. Morrison entered moments later, flanked by his defense counsel, a sharp civilian attorney who had made a career defending military men accused of crossing lines. He wore his uniform as well, but his presence was different. He carried his years of service like armor, as though they alone would acquit him. His jaw was set, his eyes hard, but there was something underneath, an unease he couldn't fully bury. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution, led by Major Sarah Chen, spoke first. She wasn't tall, wasn't loud, but her presence filled the space. A former enlisted Marine turned lawyer, she knew the weight of every word, the culture she was speaking into. This case is not about politics. It is not about ambition. It is about leadership, about a gunnery sergeant who abused his authority and a staff sergeant who refused to break. Her words were calm, deliberate, sharp. The defense countered quickly. Morrison's lawyer painted him as a dedicated leader, a Marine's Marine, targeted not for misconduct but for being too hard in a changing corps. He suggested Santos was ambitious, opportunistic, willing to weaponize sensitivity to advance herself. His words were carefully chosen, meant to undermine without seeming cruel. "This is not assault," he said. "This is a misunderstanding, exaggerated into scandal." And so the battle lines were drawn, not with rifles but with words. Witnesses came first. Marines took the stand one by one, recounting what they had seen. Some were nervous, voices wavering under the gravity of testifying against a senior NCO, but truth has a way of strengthening itself when spoken aloud. Private First Class Thompson, the youngest, walked stiffly to the witness chair. His hands gripped the wood until his knuckles whitened. "Sir," he said, voice shaking, "I saw Gunnery Sergeant Morrison put his hand on Staff Sergeant Santos's shoulder. I heard her tell him to remove it. I saw him grab her arm. She never lost her bearing. She never disrespected him. She followed regulations. He didn't." His youth made him vulnerable, but it also made him powerful. No one could accuse him of scheming. He was simply telling what he had seen. His words landed like a clean strike. Then Corporal Jackson testified. Steady, seasoned, his voice low but unshakable. He described the intimidation, the posturing, the deliberate attempts to humiliate. He spoke not just of that day, but of patterns he had observed, always sharp enough to be clear, always measured enough to be credible. His testimony didn't just corroborate Santos's, it magnified it. Marine after Marine added their voice. Each account chipped away at Morrison's defense, leaving cracks no lawyer could patch. And then came Santos. She walked to the stand, spine straight, face composed. But inside, the storm raged. Her heart hammered, her palms tingled with adrenaline. She had faced enemy fire, but this was different. This wasn't survival, it was judgment. She raised her hand, swore the oath, sat down. Her eyes met Morrison across the courtroom. For a moment it was the parade ground again, him towering, her standing. But this time the battlefield was hers. Major Chen guided her through the testimony, step by step, the formation, the comments, the contact, the grab, each detail laid out precise, unflinching. Her voice never shook. She spoke with the same discipline she had shown that morning, professional, steady, unbreakable. Then the defense began its assault. "Staff Sergeant," the lawyer started, his tone polite but cutting, "isn't it true that you have ambitions beyond your current rank?" "Yes, sir," she replied, "every Marine does." "And isn't it true," he continued, "that advancing your career would be easier if Gunnery Sergeant Morrison were removed from his position?" Her eyes didn't flicker. "My career depends on my service, not on removing others." He pressed harder, suggested her bronze star was inflated, that her leadership style was weak, that she had provoked Morrison by resisting his authority. Each question was a blade designed to nick her composure, to draw blood. But she never gave him the satisfaction. She answered calmly, factually, never raising her voice, never breaking. The lawyer circled again and again, but every strike landed against stone. And then the prosecution struck back, not with Santos but with others. Lance Corporal Martinez took the stand. Her voice trembled at first but steadied as she spoke. She described years of inappropriate comments, threats disguised as jokes, fear that had kept her silent. "I never said anything," she admitted, eyes cast down. "But when I saw Staff Sergeant Santos stand, I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Her words shifted the room. This wasn't just one moment, one clash. It was a pattern, a culture. The defense tried to discredit her, but the weight of multiple voices was too much. And then came the blow they hadn't prepared for: video evidence. Security cameras had captured part of the confrontation. It wasn't perfect. Angles were limited, but it was enough. The footage showed Morrison stepping too close, showed him grabbing Santos's arm as she stepped away. It wasn't theory anymore. It was fact on screen. Morrison took the stand in his own defense, and that was when his undoing began. Under oath, he insisted it was correction, not assault, leadership, not intimidation. But the more he spoke, the more his anger showed. His voice grew sharp, his answers clipped. The same controlling presence that had ruled the parade ground leaked into the courtroom, and the panel of officers saw it. They didn't just hear his words, they felt the aggression behind them. By the time he stepped down, his defense was crumbling. The prosecution brought in one final witness, a military psychologist. She explained how harassment and intimidation worked in military hierarchies, how patterns of power could silence subordinates, how abuse could hide under the cover of tradition. She described Morrison's behavior in clinical terms, framing it not as leadership but as pathology. The case was clear, but clarity didn't make the waiting easier. When closing arguments ended, the panel retired. 6 hours passed. 6 hours of silence, of Marines sitting stiff on benches, of Santos waiting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the panel returned, the room fell silent. The presiding officer stood. His voice carried the weight of finality. On the charge of assault, guilty. On the charge of harassment, guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming, guilty. On the charge of violating the uniform code of military justice, guilty. The words hit like thunder. The room shifted. Some gasped softly. Some bowed their heads. Some stared at Santos with awe, others with unease. Morrison's face drained of color. For the first time, the mountain of a man looked small. Santos sat still, her expression composed. Inside, her chest ached, not with triumph but with release. She hadn't fought for victory, she had fought for truth. And truth had held. But as the courtroom emptied, as Marines whispered of history made, she knew something deeper. Verdicts don't end battles, they only begin new ones. What does justice sound like when it finally arrives? Is it a cheer, a sigh of relief, or just silence heavy enough to crush the chest? The verdict had been spoken, guilty on all charges. The words echoed long after the panel left, carved into the air like stone. For some, it felt like vindication. For others, like betrayal. For Santos, it was something else entirely. It was weight, a burden that had shifted but not lifted. The sentencing phase began days later. By then, the base was already split. Marines debated in chow halls, in barracks, in hushed tones during night watch. Some spoke of accountability. Others muttered of politics, of tradition dying in the name of sensitivity. Every conversation circled back to the same two names, Santos and Morrison. The courtroom filled again, tighter than before. Marines crammed into benches, shoulders brushing. Officers stood at the back. The air hummed with tension. The prosecution began by laying out the scope of damage. Major Chen's voice was steady, unemotional, but the evidence she presented was anything but. She called more witnesses, this time, not to prove guilt, but to reveal impact. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams stepped forward first. Her voice was quiet, but the tremor in it was unmistakable. She described a deployment 3 years earlier, where Morrison's constant criticism and veiled remarks had left her doubting herself every day. It wasn't just words, she said, eyes on the panel. It was the weight of knowing I'd never be seen as good enough, no matter what I did. It broke me down piece by piece. Then came Sergeant David Kim, broad-shouldered, steady, the kind of Marine who rarely spoke unless it mattered. He told of training exercises where Morrison had crossed lines, not just with women but with men, excessive force, public humiliation, reckless disregard for safety. He didn't lead us, Kim said flatly. He controlled us. Fear doesn't build Marines, it breaks them. Each testimony stacked higher, brick by brick, until the portrait of Morrison's leadership was no longer one of iron discipline. It was corrosion. The prosecution produced records, performance evaluations showing patterns of bias, complaints filed, buried, forgotten, medical documents of Marines treated for stress and anxiety tied to hostile command climates. Even those who had never spoken aloud had left trails, now illuminated under the harsh light of scrutiny. And then came the victim impact statement. Santos rose slowly, her dress blues pristine, her face calm. She walked to the podium with the same composure she had shown on the parade ground, but the weight in the room shifted as she began to speak. Her voice was steady but softer than usual, almost restrained. I have served my country since I was 19. I've bled with my Marines. I've carried their weight when they couldn't carry themselves. I never wanted this fight. But the day Gunnery Sergeant Morrison put his hand on me, in front of 289 Marines, I realized silence was no longer an option. She paused. The silence was thick, waiting. This isn't about me. It's about every Marine who has been made to feel small when they should have been lifted. It's about the cost of intimidation, the damage of fear. I stand here not because I am stronger, but because I could not look my Marines in the eye if I stayed silent. Her words didn't crack, but her eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with a depth of pain only those who had carried too much could know. The room shifted again. Some looked down. Some clenched their jaws. Even Morrison, sitting stiffly beside his lawyer, could not fully mask the flicker of something, shame, anger, or perhaps just the recognition of loss. Then the defense made their case. Morrison's lawyer stood, his tone urgent, almost pleading. He spoke of Morrison's 2 decades of service, of deployments where he had shown tactical brilliance, of Marines trained under him who had gone on to succeed in combat. He argued that this wasn't a predator but a soldier of the old school, too hard for a new era but not malicious. He called Morrison's former superiors, men who praised his combat record, his ability to drive Marines to peak readiness. Their words painted him not as a monster but as a contradiction, competent in war, corrosive in peace. Then came the most difficult testimony, Morrison's family. His wife spoke first, voice cracking as she described the man she knew at home. He is a husband, a father, a Marine who has given his life to this service. He is not perfect, but he loves his country, he loves us. Please don't take everything from him. His teenage daughter followed. She stood small in the vastness of the courtroom, clutching a prepared statement with trembling hands. Her voice broke as she spoke. I'm proud of my dad. I don't understand everything that happened, but I know he taught me to be strong, to be brave. I just don't want to lose him. The room shifted again. Even Marines hardened by combat felt the ache of her words, because this was the truth of justice. It cuts both ways. Even the guilty leave behind those who love them. When all voices had been heard, the panel withdrew. The weight was heavy, hours stretched thin. Marines lingered in the halls, whispering, speculating. Santos sat in silence, hands folded, her expression unreadable. Morrison stared at the table before him, jaw clenched, a man built of stone now crumbling at the edges. When the panel returned, the sentence was read. Dismissal from the Marine Corps, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, 6 months confinement. The words fell with finality. Morrison's 20-year career ended not with a retirement ceremony, not with folded flags, but with disgrace. Santos exhaled, slow and steady, Not victory, not relief, just acceptance. Because this wasn't triumph, it was consequence. Outside, the sun beat down on the base as word spread. Morrison was done. Santos had not just survived, she had changed something larger than herself. But she knew it wasn't over. Justice in the courtroom is one thing. Justice in culture, in tradition, in the hearts of Marines, that was a longer war. And she would keep fighting it, quietly, firmly, the way she always had. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar, it doesn't cheer. Sometimes justice just stands, and waits, and makes sure the next Marine doesn't have to stand alone. What happens after the verdict, when the gavel falls and the courtroom empties? Do things return to normal, or does the ground itself shift beneath the weight of truth spoken aloud? For Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, there was no return to normal. Normal had burned away the moment she stood on that parade ground, refusing to bend. The trial was over. Morrison was gone. His stripes stripped, his career dissolved, his name whispered in mess halls now as warning, not legend. But the silence left behind was louder than the confrontation itself. The Marines of Charlie Company went back to training, to rifles and drills, to mud and sweat. Yet the air was different. Every command carried a new undertone, the knowledge that intimidation was no longer untouchable. Marines who had once swallowed words began to speak them. Not loudly, not recklessly, but they spoke. And Santos, 6 months later, the orders came down. She had been promoted to gunnery sergeant. The pinning ceremony was quiet, not grand. No parade ground, no speeches. Just a handful of Marines who knew what she had endured, standing in silence as the insignia was fixed to her collar. For a moment she felt the weight of it, the recognition, the respect, the confirmation that her stand had not been in vain. But with it came something heavier, expectation. Promotions were for leadership, for guidance, for those who carried not just themselves but the burden of those behind them. Her new assignment was unlike any she had known. The Equal Opportunity Office. Instead of leading squads through obstacle courses or training ranges, she now sat at desks and conference tables, shaping policy, reviewing complaints and building systems to protect Marines from the very kind of abuse she had confronted. Some saw it as exile, others saw it as honor. To Santos it was duty, different battlefield, same fight. At first the work felt slow, endless stacks of reports, meetings with officers who spoke in polished phrases, careful not to admit too much, resistance laced in polite smiles. But she pushed, steady and firm, the same way she had led her squad across mud and wire. She read the words of Marines who had filed complaints, young, old, men, women. Their stories bled into her, patterns she recognized, fear she remembered. She drafted recommendations, rewrote training modules, suggested new reporting mechanisms. Not glamorous work, not visible, but necessary. Still, there were moments she felt the isolation. Not everyone wanted change. Some whispered that she had ruined a Marine's career to build her own. Others avoided her altogether, their silence as sharp as accusation. She carried it without breaking stride, but late at night, alone in her quarters, she felt the sting. She reminded herself of Helmand, of blood in the dirt, of lives carried to safety. She reminded herself of that morning when she had said, "Remove your hand," and the silence had cracked. She reminded herself of the Marines who had stepped forward to testify. She wasn't carrying only her own burden now. She was carrying theirs too. The ripple effect spread beyond Camp Lejeune. Word of the case reached other bases, other units. Female Marines who had once kept silent began to file their own reports. Some found support. Some still found walls. But the difference was clear. The walls were weaker now. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, the officer who had stepped onto the parade ground that day, implemented sweeping changes within his command. Regular training on harassment prevention, anonymous reporting channels, leadership evaluations that included climate surveys. Some rolled their eyes, calling it political correctness. Others leaned in, recognizing it as survival for the Corps, for its future. Outside the gates, the story had become larger than the base. Media outlets covered it, advocacy groups dissected it, veterans debated it in bars and online forums. For the first time in years, the question of women in combat, of leadership accountability, of cultural change within the Corps wasn't abstract. It had a face. Her face. Santos never asked for that. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a Marine. Yet she found herself invited to speak at panels, at veteran gatherings, at training academies. She stood before rooms of strangers, recounting the moment Morrison's hand closed around her arm, the silence of nearly 300 witnesses, the choice to stand firm. Each time she told it, she felt the ache of reliving it. But she also saw the way eyes sharpened, spines straightened, voices whispered, "Maybe I can too." The Marines who had testified with her found their lives altered as well. Private Thompson, once a nervous 19-year-old fumbling with gloves, discovered that courage leaves marks. His testimony became a story told among younger Marines. He grew into his role, promoted faster than most, leading with quiet fairness. His Marines trusted him, not because he barked, but because he listened. Rodriguez, the seasoned lance corporal who had stood beside her that morning, carried the lessons into every assignment. He became an instructor at the Leadership Academy, teaching not just tactics and discipline, but the invisible weight of ethical command. His lectures carried an edge of lived truth. Leadership isn't fear, he told recruits. It's responsibility. If you use fear, you've already failed. The 289 Marines who had witnessed the confrontation carried their own scars, invisible but lasting. Some had testified. Some had remained silent, but all of them knew they had stood on sacred ground that morning. They had seen history shift. They had felt the old world crack. For Morrison, life after dismissal was harder. Stripped of rank, stripped of title, stripped of purpose, he struggled in civilian life. Jobs were scarce. His record followed him. For the first time in years, he stood without the shield of authority. Alone with his choices, his reflection was harsher than any panel's verdict. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he admitted to himself what he had never spoken aloud. Santos had shown more courage in a single breath than he had in years of command. And yet Santos thought little of him. Her focus was forward, always forward. 3 years after the trial, she found herself standing before a new formation, young Marines at the Staff Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. Her story had become part of their curriculum. Case studies, lessons, slides, but she preferred to tell it herself. She stood at the podium, her voice calm, her presence steady. She didn't embellish, she didn't dramatize, she simply told the truth. The morning sun, the confrontation, the silence, the choice. When she finished, she looked out at the faces, some skeptical, some inspired, all listening. And she said quietly, "Leadership is not about being feared. It's about being trusted. Never forget which one lasts longer." The room was silent, not the silence of fear, the silence of listening. Outside, the Corps was still changing, slowly, unevenly, but changing. And Gunnery Sergeant Santos walked away from the podium, not with pride, not with triumph, but with the quiet knowledge that her burden had become a lesson, and that lesson would live long after she was gone. Because sometimes change doesn't roar, it doesn't announce itself. Sometimes change is just one Marine standing straight, refusing to bend, until others find the courage to do the same. What happens when a single story grows too large to stay inside the wire? When whispers in barracks become questions in Congress, and one Marine's courage becomes a mirror held up to an entire institution. The Morrison case did not end in the courtroom. It spilled outward, through bases, through commands, through headlines. What had begun as a confrontation on a humid morning parade ground was now the subject of documentaries, editorials, and congressional hearings. At first, the Corps resisted. Tradition was heavy, and change had always been slow. Senior leaders framed the case as an exception, not a reflection of culture. But the sheer number of voices that emerged in the aftermath made denial impossible. The investigation had cracked open doors that had long stayed shut, and behind them were stories that sounded all too familiar. Marines who had once been silent began to speak. Not just women. Men, too. Young privates, seasoned sergeants, even officers. Their accounts varied in detail, but the pattern was clear. Intimidation disguised as discipline, harassment hidden under the shield of authority, silence demanded as the price of survival. The Corps found itself under a spotlight it could not escape. Congress called hearings. Senior generals sat stiff in uniforms under the sharp lights of committee rooms, questioned not about strategy or budgets, but about culture, accountability, and silence. Lawmakers referenced the Morrison case by name. They spoke of Staff Sergeant, now Gunnery Sergeant, Santos as the Marine who had forced a reckoning. Santos watched the hearings from her office in Washington, D.C., where she had been temporarily assigned as an advisor to the Equal Opportunity Office. She never asked to be there. She never wanted to trade desert dust and rifle drills for conference rooms and policy briefings. But the Corps had made her a symbol, and symbols were rarely given choices. She sat quietly at the back of the chamber during one session, her uniform crisp, her eyes steady. Lawmakers didn't look at her directly, but their words circled her presence. The Santos case demonstrates, as we saw with Gunnery Sergeant Santos, her name became shorthand for accountability, for reform, for the uncomfortable truth that the Corps had long delayed facing. Inside, she felt the weight of it pressing down. She had fought for dignity, not for spotlight. But once history decides you are a lesson, it rarely asks for your permission. The reforms began in waves. New reporting channels, expanded training, stronger protections for whistleblowers. Command climate surveys made mandatory with results tied to officer evaluations. On paper it was sweeping. In practice it was halting. Resistance remained. Some Marines embraced the changes, relieved that silence was no longer the default. Others muttered in corners, claiming tradition was being eroded, that the Corps was bending to politics. Santos heard it all. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself in those moments. She simply worked, writing policies, reviewing reports, traveling base to speak with Marines directly. Her message was always the same, delivered with calm firmness. This is not about weakening the Corps. It's about making it stronger. But even as reforms spread, Santos lived with the scars. Not physical ones, those had long healed, but the invisible kind. There were still Marines who looked at her as a troublemaker, who avoided her gaze in the halls. Some would never forgive her for speaking out, not because she had been wrong, but because she had broken silence. And yet, for every cold shoulder, there was another Marine who quietly stopped her in passing, offered a handshake, a nod, or whispered, "Thank you." Those moments carried her more than any medal or policy, because it meant that somewhere, someone else had been spared what she endured. The story grew beyond the Corps. Documentaries aired, interviews were requested. Advocacy groups invited her to speak. She accepted few, not because she was ashamed, but because she feared the story would stop being about the Marines who had suffered and become only about her. She resisted being turned into an icon. But sometimes she relented. She stood before audiences of veterans, of young cadets, of women in uniform who were just beginning their careers. She spoke softly, without flourish, without dramatics. "I never wanted to be here," she often began. "I only wanted to be a Marine. But sometimes doing your duty doesn't mean carrying a rifle. Sometimes it means standing still when the world tells you to move. And sometimes it costs you more than you expected." Her words lingered in those rooms long after she left. Meanwhile, the ripple of her case continued through the ranks. Investigations into other leaders began. Some were disciplined, some quietly retired. Others, emboldened by the change, shifted their leadership styles, choosing respect over fear, mentorship over intimidation. It wasn't perfect. The culture didn't change overnight, but the shift was undeniable. Back at Camp Lejeune, Marines who had once stood in that silent formation began to rise in their own careers. Thompson, now a sergeant, led his Marines with the quiet strength of someone who had seen what courage looked like up close. Rodriguez, promoted to Master Sergeant, taught leadership at the academy, weaving the Morrison case into lessons about integrity and accountability. They carried the memory of that morning not as a wound, but as a compass. For Santos, the years passed in a blur of work, policies drafted, training programs launched, bases visited. She spoke less of Morrison now, more of the Marines who had found their voices after him. She carried herself with the same steady calm, though the fire inside never dimmed. At night, when the offices emptied and the city outside buzzed with civilian life, she sometimes sat alone at her desk, staring at the framed photo of her squad in Afghanistan. Faces sunburned, uniforms dusty, smiles thin but real. She remembered dragging their bodies to safety under fire. She remembered why she had stayed, why she had fought. Not for recognition, not for reform, for them, always for them. And yet the irony was inescapable. She had survived bullets, mortars, fire. But it was a fellow Marine's hand on her arm that had nearly broken her career and had instead changed the core. History is cruel like that. It doesn't choose the moments of glory. It chooses the moments of fracture. Years later, Santos would look back and see the reforms spreading, the culture shifting, the Marines she had led now leading others. And she would know, quietly, that the moment she had once dreaded had become the moment that defined her. Because sometimes history isn't written in victories. Sometimes it's written in the silence of a parade ground, shattered by one Marine refusing to bow. What remains when the dust settles, when years pass, when the faces of the witnesses fade into new generations of uniforms? What does one moment leave behind? 5 years had gone by since the parade ground, since the confrontation that had torn silence wide open in front of nearly 300 Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos now stood at another formation, this time at the Staff Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. Rows of Marines, young and sharp, stood before her. They were not the same faces who had watched Morrison fall, but they carried the same burden, the need for leaders who would choose integrity over fear. Her hair was flecked with the faintest gray now, her shoulders broader with years, but her posture was as steady as it had been that morning. She wasn't here to relive the past. She was here to ensure it never repeated. She looked out at the Marines, men and women, some barely older than she had been when she joined. Their eyes were curious, cautious, waiting. She began not with stories of medals or deployments, but with a question. "What will you do?" she asked softly, "when the easy path is silence, but the right path is to stand?" The silence in the room was heavy. She let it linger, let them feel the weight of it the way she had once felt it pressing on her chest. Then she told them, not with theatrics, not with flourish, the story. The humid morning, the eyes of 289 Marines, the hand on her shoulder, the choice. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. Truth, spoken plainly, carried more power than embellishment ever could. She ended the way she always did. Leadership is not about fear. It is about trust. Never forget which one lasts longer. When she stepped down, the room stayed silent. Not the silence of resistance, but of thought. She had planted seeds. What they grew into, that was up to them. Outside the academy, the core itself had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but it had shifted. Reporting systems were stronger. Leaders were held to higher standards. Harassment was no longer shrugged off as just the way it is. Some still resisted, clinging to the old ways, muttering about tradition. But others embraced the new current, shaping a culture that demanded respect as much as readiness. The Marines who had once stood in that formation carried their own legacies forward. Private Thompson, now Staff Sergeant Thompson, led his own squad. His Marines trusted him because he never used fear. He remembered what it felt like to see a leader stand against intimidation, and he built his leadership on that memory. When a young Marine once asked him why he was different, he answered quietly, "Because I know what right looks like." Rodriguez had risen to Master Sergeant, teaching at the Leadership Academy. He wove the Morrison case into his curriculum, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as doctrine. He told young leaders, fear can control for a moment. Respect can lead for a lifetime. Choose wisely. Even Morrison's shadow lingered, not in presence but in lesson. Marines spoke of him not with respect but with warning. His name became shorthand for what not to become. And Morrison himself, his life after dismissal was marked by struggle. Civilian jobs came and went. The weight of his choices never left. In quiet moments, far from uniforms and parade grounds, he sometimes admitted to himself that Santos had been right, that her strength had shown him a reflection he had never wanted to see. But admissions whispered to empty rooms changed nothing. His legacy was already written. For Santos, life moved forward. She had been selected for promotion to first sergeant, returning to operational leadership after years in policy and reform. She carried with her the lessons of both the battlefield and the courtroom. She was no longer just a Marine who had endured. She was a Marine who had reshaped. She walked bases where Marines she had never met greeted her by name. Some saluted sharper because of what she represented. Others avoided her gaze, unwilling to confront the change she embodied. She accepted both reactions without judgment. Symbols are rarely loved by all. At night, when the day's work was done, she sometimes sat with old photographs. Her squad in Afghanistan. Faces now scattered to different units, different lives. She remembered their laughter in rare quiet moments, their grit in firefights, the weight of their bodies when she had carried them out of blood and smoke. Those memories reminded her why she had chosen to stand, not for policy, not for reform, but for Marines who deserved leaders they could trust. Years later, when she stood at retirement ceremonies or mentoring sessions, younger Marines asked her the same question: was it worth it? She never answered directly. She never spoke of pride, never called it victory. She simply said it was necessary. Because some fights are not about winning. They're about refusing to lose what matters most. Her story spread far beyond her control. It became part of training manuals, documentaries, case studies at military academies. Foreign officers studied it as an example of institutional accountability. Veterans spoke of it as a turning point in culture. Civilians heard it as proof that change was possible even in the hardest of institutions. But to Santos, it remained something simpler: a choice, a mourning, a hand on her shoulder, and the refusal to bend. The Marines who had stood in silence that day carried it forward into their own commands, their own lives. Some told their children about it. Some carried it only in memory, but all of them knew they had been part of something larger than themselves. And as the years passed, that mourning became less about Morrison, less about the courtroom, and more about the lesson it had carved into the core. That dignity doesn't need permission, that courage can be quiet, that leadership is measured not by fear but by trust. On the anniversary of that day, Santos sometimes walked the parade ground alone. The sun still heavy, the air still thick. She would stand for a moment, her boots pressing into the same dirt where history had turned. She didn't linger long, just long enough to remind herself of what it had cost and what it had changed. And then she would walk on, leaving only footprints behind. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in acting, it changes everything.